Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to make a traditional land acknowledgement. Since this program is being held virtually, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture all of our locations. I will share the Peel Region acknowledgement and invite everyone to consider their own position with regards to the land on which they find themselves. The land on which we gather and which the Region of Peel operates is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land and continue to do so today. In particular, the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. Thank you. Today, we are joined by Jim Leonard, PAMA Supervisors of Archives. I hope everyone is excited to learn more about how to care for our records. I know I am, so over to you, Jim, to share all your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Lauren. It's good to be back, and hello, everybody. Welcome to our second Lunch and Learn. This is, we sort of tagged it as part 2, but really it's still a standalone presentation where we'll be touching on a few things that we talked about last time and maybe talk about certain things in more detail, but there'll be a lot of new information here. And if anyone feels like they would like to see the old presentation or have a copy of it, I'm sure we can make arrangements to make sure that happens. But we'll get right into it. So last year I looked a lot at things like preservation and care for the vast material we might have in boxes and under beds and in various places around our house, and what could be done to sort of get you starting to think about how to protect and take control of the material and to digitize it and things of that sort. But this year we'll take a closer look, more with a step-by-step DIY kind of approach, where I'm using my own example of this sort of work when I started a project, which turned out to be larger than I might have expected back in the around 2007, 2008. But first, I just want to talk about some of the highlights from last time. The key points, these are just a summary of the key points. We looked at things in nature that conspire to try to return things that we have that we want to protect back to their basic elements. For example, with newsprint, that photograph of a newspaper on the right shows over time, paper will deteriorate. It's got acidity built into it, and if it's at least wood pulp paper, and that's called inherent vice. It's a factor of decay built into the very material we're trying to protect. And with things like humidity and sunlight and pests and pollutants and just basic neglect too, that can all be damaged and eventually can even be destroyed. So it's important to protect everything. Did we just lose our picture? Or...
No, the slide's still up.
All good? Okay.
Yep.
For some reason it disappeared on me. Anyway, but and then places in your house to store things safely. We don't all have climate controlled storage for our collections like we do in a museum or an archives or an art gallery. So we have to find places around our house to try to protect materials. And the general rule of thumb is if something is safe for you, if it's comfortable, if the space is comfortable for you, it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's also good for the material you're trying to protect, such as in your bedroom, home office, and spaces like that. Also, a lot of places to avoid, basements and attics, places where you can have water damage, flooding, and sudden fluctuations in temperature and humidity, those are bad. And then, certain other things like storage supplies that you can acquire, not always from a conservation supplies store, although there are some in the GTA and other places in North America. You can also find suitable supplies in some cases at places like craft supply stores like Michael's or at a camera store like Henry's. And that, there's certain types of materials you need to do to protect things. Now, we would have done this presentation, the part 2 so-called, sooner. I think we did part 1 last April, but later that month, we received official funding that for the archives, at least, that we were involved in a project that the museum was already starting up, which was an upgrade of our HVAC system, that's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. And so we got a great deal of money put in front of us, partly, I guess, because of COVID and recovery needs associated with that. And it helps. And now the museum and the art gallery, or archives, I should say, are launching a massive project to upgrade our HVAC systems. But in order for that to happen, we had to, in both cases with the museum and with us, remove our collections from our storage vaults And the picture on the right shows just one of the glimpses of one of our storage vaults as they are. We have 2 storage spaces on site at PAMA in the archives, and these spaces had to be emptied completely of every single item. And in our case, it's about almost 1.6 linear kilometers of records. It's fast. And so we had to plan very methodically how to get everything out in order to preserve its integrity and its order and where it's in its location considerations and this sort of thing. So everything had to be carefully moved and very systematically moved off site. And then we ended up with a space devoid of records, but still shelving. And it had to be turned into this. And then finally that. And then the spaces were completely emptied. And then now the construction work has begun. And all of this was going on while we were dealing with this, the pandemic, of course, which we've been closed to the public because of COVID since March of 2020. And it's an unavoidable, very difficult, obviously, situation for everybody. And it makes doing an ordinary job that much more difficult. And it certainly makes a mega project like removing your entire collection from the site extremely difficult. And we've all been dealing with this nightmare in our own ways, but it just compounds everything and makes everything more difficult. So we would have done this presentation sooner, and I do apologize that we couldn't do it because of all these forces that were competing against our time. At any rate, let's get right into it. As I say, I'm going to look at a project I started and have mostly completed, and I'm going to talk first about the motivations behind it. This is the picture of my daughter, Laura, and she was born in 2009. And before she was born, my wife and I were thinking about some of the things we might want to do just to get ready and try to get some things done, obviously before the business of baby. And so what we did was, one of the things I knew I wanted to do was deal with a lot of the material that had been accumulating in our house, mostly photographs, family photos. And I guess because of my job, I became the de facto unofficial archivist for my family. And that meant over time, lots of material seemed to come my way from various members of various branches of the family. So be it, I said, well, I guess I'll try to deal with that. And one of the things I thought would be nice would be to create a photo wall of pictures so my daughter could see what some of her relatives looked like, some of the people that we knew and loved when we were young, and people that, of course, were long gone in many cases, or were quite elderly if they were still with us. We wanted to create something just to give our daughter a sense of our own family legacy so she could understand that as well. And I think having a visual representation of the people we know and love is a good way to do that, in a powerful way. But the other factor was simply a pragmatic and practical situation, which was we had vast amounts of records and we needed to put some control around this material. And more material was coming in. As I said, I was a family archivist, so to speak. So the trickle of material kept coming my way, and I finally decided we have to take control of this stuff. So, and it was probably 2007, I really started to think about it. How am I going to preserve the material that is coming my way? And we're talking about a lot of material, actually. And what are we going to do to take some control of it? So that's what we got into. And this is what it looks like. And the first thing I did when I started contemplating how to tackle this stuff was I wanted to get a sense of the big picture. I wanted to know what we had and where it all was, and try to consolidate the material and ideally have it all in one place, one safe place in our house. And this is more or less what some of it looked like. Everything was in bins and boxes. I wanted to make sure everything was contained to keep dust off of it and keep light away from it and that sort of thing. Then I thought, well, we have to take stock. I have to know what is here, how much of it is here, how is it organized, or is it even organized at all? And also, what kind of material is, just back that up a bit, what kind of material is prints? What's negatives? Do I have any film reels, any VHS tapes? What kind of context and associations do these records have besides somehow being associated with me or members of my family? So I did a bit of an analysis to see what was here and how it was organized, or how it should be organized. And this is how it was broken down for me. And because I was dealing with family papers and materials that related to my family, the natural order of things was to maintain and to look at this material by branch of the family. My mother's side, my father's side, the immediate family, that's myself and my brothers and sisters, and more contemporary photographs. And then also, as with any group of records, you'll usually have unidentified miscellaneous materials of Midland value in most cases, but still you want to track it and preserve it till you make a final decision whether to keep it or not. So this is how things naturally broke down, and I wanted to maintain the filing system as it existed, as rough as it might be. Everything seemed to come to me by branch of the family, and that's something that for various reasons you want to preserve because it maintains context and furthers your understanding of how things relate to each other. The next thing was to get a handle on material. In many cases, I had photographs and documents that, especially with the case of photographs, a lot of this came my way without any identification or minimal identification. The only thing I really had to go on was the fact that this related to whatever branch of the family it was. So that much at least I had as a starting point, as a foundation. So I had to figure out how can I identify a bit more information and capture a bit more information, at least about the most important and most interesting and most iconic photographs that I have, the ones that I'm most interested in copying, digitizing. So with the unidentified photos, I knew, there's several resources, more so now than there was back in 2007 and 8 when I started this project, to help you identify certain things about the picture, such as using fashion and characteristics and details in the shots, in the photographs, to help you at least establish a date or a location. And if you're lucky, in some cases, you can identify who the people are. It's not always easy. And one of the ways of doing that is what we call an archives content analysis, where you read the photograph and look for certain clues that can help you with certain things. For example, in this photograph, fashion can help you date the photographs. Anyone who's may have spent some time watching, binge watching shows like Downton Abbey or have watched the movie Titanic, for example, will get a sense pretty quickly of what Edwardian dress looked like. This is an example of Edwardian dress, formal fashion, where people are wearing brimmed hats and stiff, tall collars. And this actually is a photograph of my grandparents on my mother's side, my mom's parents, taken in 1917, as it turns out. And if you see a photo like this, and it's a couple, and they're standing rather formally in a sort of a setup in a composition such as this, chances are it's a wedding photograph. And this certainly, as it turns out, was that. And I knew roughly when they were married, had the year, and I was able to later confirm the dates and so on through other records. But if I hadn't had that information, I would have at least known it was Edwardian because of the collar and the hat. And if you're trying to date photographs that way, and if you don't already know what Edwardian or late Victorian dress looks like, the internet can be one of your best friends, because there are all kinds of resources online. And you can look up shirt collars, assume it's 19th century or something of that sort, men, women, hats, men and women's shoes. These are all kinds of things that can help you identify at least the date of a photo. Obviously, you're not going to identify the individuals, but you can at least confirm dates in some cases. As I say, the internet can provide you with all sorts of tools. And there's things like online catalogs that help with this sort of stuff as well. Whoops, overshot there. And then you got a photograph like this, which can help you date, in this case, other aspects of a photo by not so much fashion, although that still applies here, like that man with the bowler hat on, standing at the counter. And you can't really see what the women are wearing at the seats behind him, but I get the sense because it looks like it's Edwardian as well. But the real tells here that help you date a photograph would be things like the clock on the wall, the pattern, that's called a frieze up there at the top, with the wallpaper pattern. It's very distinctive. It looks a bit like an Art Nouveau design. That helps you date things, the style of the chandelier. Some of the details in the room on the left are posters. And if you look beyond the poster, on the left side on the wall is a calendar. And if you could just zoom in, you might be able to read the actual year on that calendar. So that kind of detail can help. On the right, there's all kinds of pamphlets and brochures and things like that can all help. You might be lucky, as I said, and see something that tells you what the date might be. I do happen to know this picture is a shot of a CPR ticket counter in Cobourg, Ontario, where my family came from. And I don't quite know why it's in our collection of photos, but it is. So at least I know what it is, but I don't know how else it's associated with us. The other thing that you can do, and this is, again, where it ties back to having understanding of the branch of the family, and if the material is associated with a branch of the family, to keep it with that to keep the context and the associations and the historical connections together. This is a case where doing that kind of thing helps. We had a photograph on the left here of the two gentlemen with rifles, one kneeling and one not. Unidentified. It came to us from a branch of my family. It's called the Lucas family. That's their surname. And it came in with a bunch of other material from the Lucas family, but we didn't know what the photograph was. But it stood out for me because it was the oldest photograph we had in this group of material, the oldest thing we have at all from this branch of my family. And I just loved the composition of the image. It was quite interesting. And it appears to have been a studio reprint of an even earlier photograph. And it's on what's called a carte de visite, which already dates it to at least the mid-Victorian era. But it was definitely from a much earlier photo, probably in another older format. And then maybe a year or two after I saw that old photo with the men with the rifles, a cousin of mine sent me the photograph of the older gentleman with the chin beard, and it's identified as Captain Lucas, circa 1870. So I remember looking at the face of that man and thinking, that reminds me of the fellow I saw in the shop with the rifle that's considerably older. I wonder if it's the same guy. And so I compared the two, and as I show it with the lines pointing, I tried to see if there's any characteristics. So I put the two pictures side by side and said to myself, I think the mouth is similar. I think the eyes are similar, the shape of the nose, the general characteristics, plus the younger fellow with the rifle who's kneeling also has a chin beard as well. And in my opinion, after looking at this and talking to a few of my relatives, we came to the consensus that that early shot is likely a shot of the same fellow, Captain. His name was John Lucas, and he was in the Merchant Navy. He was born in Yorkshire, and he went off, on adventures on the Australian Gold Rush. And finally, he ended up in Haliburton, Ontario, and was one of the people that settled that town. So he was an important relative. He's my great-great-great-grandfather. So I was quite excited because I think we do have a photograph of him, but I will never be, or it's very likely I'll never know 100%. So there's always going to be some hedging on it, but I think there's a good chance it's him. And when you're looking at old photos, and certainly some of these early ones have this, if you look on the back, you will often see a studio stamp, which sometimes, and unfortunately not in this case, because you see the studio's name is Frank Crawford, photo artist. I've never been able to track that name down anywhere. But in many cases you can, and there's guides that can help you, like the photographers in Ontario. There's the Ontario Photographers List, which is quite useful and can help a lot up to a certain point in time. Newspapers can help too. And again, you can certainly search the internet, and sometimes you're lucky. But I never found anything to help me confirm anything about the specific shot from that. And then this kind of thing of comparing facial features has become a growing, almost a science, you might even say, or a pseudoscience, it depends. And it comes up a lot with Abraham Lincoln for some reason. On the left is a large twin photograph. Here is obviously a confirmed photo of President Abraham Lincoln. And on the right is a dapper younger man who might, in some people's thoughts, might be Abraham Lincoln as a younger man. If you look on the right with a photograph, it's somewhat smaller. It has a confirmed younger shot of Lincoln and this younger man. They're roughly about the same age in the photograph. And a fellow named Albert Kaplan found that early shot of this unidentified person, and he thought after a while that he thought it was Abraham Lincoln. It was an original case photo called the daguerreotypes. It was quite old and a one-of-a-kind shot, and if it was Lincoln, it was a previously unknown image of the man, and it would be worth a great deal of money if it was confirmed to be him. At the time, this is now the 1980s when this Kaplan fellow found the shot. At that time, it was estimated to have been worth $1 million if it could have been confirmed. He was a retired stockbroker. He had some means, so he hired a former plastic surgeon to do a facial analysis of this man and try to make comparisons by the position of eyes to nose and wideness of the bridge of the nose and things like this to try to say and claim that that man was Abraham Lincoln as a younger fellow before he grew his famous beard. I personally don't think it is. In fact, and many people in the groups that know Lincoln or study him, like the Lincoln Society, generally were skeptical, but the fellow was trying to make the claim that it was, and for obviously it would certainly help him gain value from the image that he got at an auction. Anyway, this kind of thing happens. Sometimes it is on money, and sometimes maybe not. But it's an interesting kind of technique to help identify people. Another thing that's important when you're analyzing photos, the unknowns or the mystery photos where there might be something, but you're not 100% sure, is you can often determine the location, again, based on whatever's visually within the image that you can use as a clue. Now, I'm using an example here, not from my own photos, but from material that we have in our collection at PAMA. And I tried this location content analysis techniques with these photos. We got an album a few years ago related to the William Perkins Bull family. They were a Brampton family that were, and Perkins Bull was the de facto historian of Peel County. And one of his brothers was involved in the First World War. His name was Geoffrey Harper Bull, and he died in battle in France in 1917. And he had albums and notebooks and things like this. And the family had an album that they put together after the war, perhaps in 1919 or 1920 or so, where they wanted to travel through the war-torn sections of Europe, mostly in France and Belgium. And this became known as battlefield tourism or war tourism. And many people, if they had certain means and could travel, wanted to see basically, I guess, the carnage in the post-war, immediate post-war era. And in some cases, I think too, they wanted to go on a pilgrimage, maybe find where their loved one had died during the war. And that possibly is what happened here, because Geoffrey Harper died in 1917. And I think the family maybe wanted to find out more about that. And for closure, so to speak, wanted to see the scenes. And what I thought was, with this album that came in that was related to the Bulls, there's all these interesting photographs of scenery, landmarks, damaged or otherwise, in various parts of Western Europe in the war. But most of them actually were not identified at all, but I did have certain clues. I knew where the war was, where most of the action occurred. And many of these images showed landmarks that might otherwise be easy enough to identify. As it turns out, I tried these techniques, and the shot on the right, which is from the album, looked familiar. I think I'd seen an image like this in the past, and as it turns out, I did, because that's what the photo on the left is. It's a documentary photo from the time, from someone else presumably doing a similar kind of war tourism. This is in Ypres. This is in West Flanders in Belgium, and this is called the Cloth Hall Cathedral. So it was a major landmark, and it's since been rebuilt, but the damage was almost complete, except for a portion of this tower. And the photographer in the documentary photo on the left from 1919 was in the exact position, essentially, as the photographer with the Bull family on the right. So I was able to confirm that one 100%. And then in this shot, this is on the right, is from the album. On the left, I was able to use Google Street View to confirm this other shot. And I used a search term like church, Belgium, landmark, steeples, as these are the search terms in a Google search, image search mostly. And after a lot of searching around and slogging, I was able to find this church and compared it with the photo and confirmed again that it was that church. This is actually called St. Nicholas Church in Ghent in Flanders. It's also known as the Three Towers because there's three steeples there. But this is something that can only be possible, in my opinion, with something like Google Image Search and Street View, where you can position yourself with your cursor to, if you find where you are in exactly the position where the photographer might be. The other thing that's helpful is a lot of European landmarks are still intact if they weren't otherwise completely destroyed during both World Wars. Chances are they're still standing, and if you can narrow it down, you might be lucky and find them. This took some work. It was a lot of fun, actually, but I would say it's easy, but it's certainly fun to try. And I was able, in some cases, to be successful. In others, it's just impossible. It depends what the picture gives you. When you pick your battles and pick what you think is easiest to work with. But I do recommend trying it. And if you do collect a lot of information and compile certain specific data, confirmed data, especially with relating to identifying people, it's good to create a quick reference binder. I thought it was a good idea when I was putting together the information about my family photos. As they were identified or when they were known, I wanted to have a reference copy, so I'd take a photocopy of them and create a binder like this, not only for myself, but for other people who might want to have reference copies of these photographs, and it can help you identify later shots. If somebody comes in that looks like some of the people in these albums, you can confirm it with the album. This becomes a visual reference tool. Another tool that I do recommend if you're working on especially a large family history project or trying to capture images of your vast family members, if you end up having a lot, is to create a family tree, especially if you don't have all of this in your head very carefully set, and some people do. avid genealogists tend to be very good at keeping a lot of this information in their heads, but even they too, of course, want it written down in some format. And that's where nowadays, with the internet and the computer systems that we all have at our disposal, we can use amazing software to keep our family information together and to keep new information as it comes in one place where it's safe and sound and easy to reference and add to as time goes on, or correct and revise as need be, and to generate visual representations of how all the families relate to each other. Now, I found this useful for myself, for my own family, but when I was doing it for my wife's family, which I'm less familiar with, it was even more helpful. And I wouldn't call myself an avid genealogist per se. I certainly know the techniques, but I did a basic tree, and it just built over time. And as I say, it becomes, again, a very useful reference tool when you're trying to get a handle on all these branches of your families. And then you get to the point where you have the information contained, you've done all the work you can to identify and document. Then if your objective is to digitally capture a lot of this information, which, believe me, is a very good thing to try to do, then you want to plan your digitization project. And that's certainly what I did next after I got through all the previous work I just outlined. And one of the first things you look at is how much volume. Again, when you're at this outset, I talked about getting a sense of the lay of the land. You're kind of doing that again, but this time with an applied project in mind. The more volume you have, the more content you have, the more planning is required and the more time is needed to complete the work. If you want to scan everything, that's going to take years if it's a lot of material, or if it's all you have is one shoebox full of material, well, you might get that done in a week, but you tailored the work to the scale of the material you want to digitize. It's really that simple. It's just common sense. What I recommend, especially if you have a lot, is don't put any pressure on yourself. Take your time, work in batches, consider small projects first and build up from there. In which case, the best thing to do is think of some priorities and set priorities. And there's two that I would always use. One is by condition. If the material is very fragile, if you have photographs that are fading or they're torn and they're important to you, they might be priority for scanning, because then you can capture and protect the image and the information it contains in digital form. The other way of looking at it is to look at it from a sentimental side. What means the most to you on an emotional level? Who are these people? Are they people you remember? Are they important? Your grandparents and great-grandparents, direct descendants, people of that sort in your family and that status in your family you're going to likely consider the most important. You may also have images, personal photos, baby pictures of your children or yourself, even as a child, that mean a lot to you, or that make you smile or move you in some way. In some way, they're iconic. Those are the ones I would recommend as priorities as well, and get those out of the way and scan first. In my case, these are just a few of the examples of pictures that I prioritized. Mostly the condition was fine, so I didn't have to worry about that so much, but I wanted to be representative of the various branches of my family, especially what ultimately my goal was to put some kind of wall display up with framed images. So I wanted to have a good representation of various people that meant something to me from my family. And we happened to have some interesting shots, and I picked and chose and went for the most iconic, at least to me, iconic images first, and worked off of that. And then once that was completed, worked on to the next priority and so on. And planning is important. I just wanted to touch on a project we do at work. We do some of the same techniques at work when we're dealing with large bodies of photographic negatives. These are a series of photos representing something we did with something called the Russell K. Cooper foam. We have thousands, 14,000 film negatives. They were originally in these pouches, which the photographer generated when the photograph session was done. Russell Cooper was active in the late 40s through the early 60s as a professional photographer. He was a photojournalist. He worked for the Toronto Telegram, and he took some very, very interesting photographs of news events around the world. And for example, on the right is President Eisenhower and Winston Churchill at a conference in Bermuda in the late 50s, early 50s, I should say, and other things like natural events and disasters such as a train derailment, which was in Peel. So he had a lot of Peel pictures, but he had also some shots from around the world, but it was a vast amount of material. And it took a long time to plan to do what we wanted to do with them, which was to rehouse them all in acid-free enclosures instead of the original pouches, and still preserve the pouches and the information they contain, and scan most or all of them, and then rehouse and box and everything. And it took years to do it. But it was something I felt was a priority, so we made it a top priority when I started working at the archives at PAMA. And through trained summer students and our own reprographics technician, Nick Moreau, we got the project done. But it took a lot of planning and it took years, but it was worth the effort. So once you've got your scanning project in mind, you have to confirm you have the equipment to do the work, obviously. And for most things, a flatbed scanner is your best bet. They usually can offer the most quality capture and versatility in types of shapes and materials, including slides. Obviously, it has to be tied to a computer of some sort. And if you don't have a flatbed scanner, a camera on a tripod preferably can be done too. And you're definitely going to need software. It's important to have a piece of software, like for example, Photoshop, and there's several others. Some come by default with every computer as part of the software suite that you have. So most people work off laptops now, which are quite helpful for this because you might want to have some mobility. And you want to have a clean table, obviously as large and open a workspace as your house offers, so that you can have usually the way I do it, on the left, I have the unscanned images, and on the right, I have the scanned images, and then they're segregated so they can keep track of what has been worked on and what hasn't been. So you want to have order and clean, good housekeeping in the space you're working in, and ideally in a space where you can shut the door when you're finished so that the dog or the cat doesn't come in and jump on everything and somehow cause some damage. The software, I'll just mention what you can do with that. Those who may be starting and haven't yet worked with it, is very helpful for color correction, for cropping images after they've been scanned, for zooming in to ensure the quality is there, that it isn't blurry or somehow distorted in some way. And it's needed too when you're file naming. So you have to obviously assign a file name to every scanned image you create. And if you don't have a flatbed scanner and all you have is even a basic mobile phone, can be helpful if you don't have a camera on a tripod, although combination usually works. But if you don't have those kinds of pieces of equipment, a phone such as this can be done too, and you can capture a relatively decent image as long as you keep a steady hand. This is more useful if you're out visiting relatives or you're at another archive, you have to run across a photo or a document of interest and they allow you to take pictures. I recommend you take the chance, and if you have a mobile phone, definitely take a shot. And there's apps that can help with that as well, like in lieu of photograph software that you work with a scanner, you can have app software that works with your mobile phone. So I do recommend that as a technique, but I would certainly say that a flatbed scanner is more able. The other thing then, once your equipment needs are all out of the way and you know what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, you want to consider the scanning specifications. I talked about this in the earlier presentation last year. You want to ideally, if the software permits it and the hardware permits it, scan everything in TIFF format, TIF or TIFF file format. That preserves more of the information in the image. They do result in bigger files, however, but they make a good master copy of images. And then if not that, JPEGs. If you're scanning off your phone, or in some cameras too, you may only be able to scan as a JPEG, which is a more common file format, but it produces a slightly less fulsome image in resolution. You always want to gear up for at least a minimum of 1 megabyte file size. So after you take a print, you want to check the image to make sure that the file size is as large as it can be in bytes. The more, the better. Although it doesn't have to be, after a certain point, I don't think it matters. But, you know, at least a minimum of 1 megabyte, ideally, to get a shot that can then be enlarged and reproduced. As you scan, you want to test. So you want to test your output. You want to test the specifications. And if you need be, you can use software in your scanning system to refine the work. So do a lot of trial and error before you start scanning in earnest. Take some shots of different types and colors, black and white, sepia tone, and so on. And maybe negatives. If you have negatives, experiment with those too, and take some scans and confirm your specifications. And then, as I say, as you scan in earnest, do quality checks now and then to make sure everything is as it should be. When you're handling photo prints and photo negatives, always wear cotton gloves. That's another thing I mentioned last time. And as I said, keep track of what's been scanned and what hasn't, and off you go. The other thing to consider after you generate the image through your scanner or whatever tool you're using, you want to have a place to put them. So you have to consider how you organize your electronic files and folders to make sure you can keep everything as it should be and to retrieve things later on when you want to. And I used I had everything organized by family and branches of the family. So when I was setting up my file folder setup, I used it. I broke it down by the same method by members of the family, starting with surname. So my family names are Lucas, Leonard, Romano, Wark. My wife's family is Wilcox. So we broke it down that way. And I looked into, in this example, I'm showing the Romano family. And with the file names, it reflects the same general kind of organizational structure. Again, the file name always starts with the surname, so I can always identify what branch of the family the file is associated with. And then I decided location is helpful because members of the Romano family were in other parts of Ontario and other parts of the world, mostly in Cobourg. So I wanted to differentiate them from others elsewhere in Ontario. And then year and where I knew it, other information that related to the subject, to the content of the photo. In this case, these shots in this folder were all from an album that my grandfather generated back in around 1910 to 1914 or so. And he had included shots of the train station when soldiers were going off to World War I, shots from the downtown and other things of that sort. So this is a file formatting system that worked for me. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, but there always has to be a bit of a hierarchy where the higher level is the folder, broken down in this case by family member, because that reflects the real world organization of the photographs and material in my collection. And then within that, the file system, as you can see. And as you can see, I'm trying to be as consistent as possible in my naming conventions. Consistency is important, and it does help keep things neat and tidy and retrievable later on. And then, of course, comes the issue of storage of your digital images. When I first started this project, as I said, it was around 2007. All I really had at my disposal were writable CDs to store the work that I was scanning. The images that I was scanning were burned onto CDs. Nowadays, I wouldn't use a CD. I don't think there's a stable and storage medium as they were once thought to be. They do tend to deteriorate over time, and you always have to be watchful of them. So a few years after I did all that, I decided to migrate copies to a portable hard drive, and I made actually 2 or 3 copies of it actually on portable drive, one of which I put off site as a backup in our safety deposit box at a bank. And if you have a safety deposit box and you get through this project, you know, that's something I recommend you do. And maybe every couple of years, go visit the box and take home the drive and just make sure the contents are safe and sound. Put a little electricity through it because it helps ensures the stability of the medium, the recording medium that the contents are on. And then the other thing I'm thinking of now is migrating all this to the cloud, and that could be Dropbox or OneDrive or Apple's iCloud system. In which case there, I think it would ultimately be the most stable and presumably secure as long as your passwords are secure. But as the technology evolves, or as upgrades come, or as we learn things about older technology, or as obsolescence starts to rear its head, you have to be prepared to migrate all the work you've done to a safer, more stable, more practical storage medium. So keep that in mind as you do this, especially if you have a lot of material and high resolution images, which mean large file sizes, because it's a bit of a project. So just some general tips. You can always refine your filing system, whether it's your folder system in your drives or how you name them. That's something you can change and alter as time goes on. But again, the rule should be consistency and what makes sense. You are not scanning your original shots in order to destroy them or throw them away and use the digital copies as your master. You don't do that. I don't recommend it, certainly. You protect your originals as well, so they're in tandem. They'll always be your masters. The digital copies are just a more versatile way of using those images. And as I already mentioned, reassess your technology as new technology becomes more available. I just wanted to now do a brief shout out for another aspect of what material most of us might, if we're lucky, have. In this case, moving images, home movies, things of that sort. I personally think home movies are gold. I think they are fascinating. And if you were lucky to have old VHS tapes of birthday parties and events and holidays, you definitely want to try to keep them and protect them as well. And they present their own preservation challenges, especially if it's reels of film, for example, or very odd or outmoded cassette tapes, like Sony U-matic cassettes, which are quite obsolete, but the information isn't, so you want to protect that. What I like about film footage is it animates history. It brings history to life in a way that a still photograph really can't. And if you do have these kinds of things, you do want to try to preserve them. I certainly have tried. It's a whole different sensory impact, as I said. It's quite interesting to see people who were otherwise just being a static still photograph moving, especially if there's sound and color associated with that. But there are special considerations with family movies, home movies. This is an example of one that we have. This is my mother's side of the family. That's my mother on the right, over here on the right side, the page boy cut, I think that's called. She was about 7 years old at this time. This was in 1929 in Coburg. This is my Romano family. My mother's maiden name was Romano. And so my grandfather, who took most of the film footage, and his wife, my grandmother, and my great-grandfather's on the bottom, that man with the large mustache. And these are, of course, stills from the motion picture film. And this movie was known to exist. My mother knew of the film, but she hadn't seen it since she was a child, and we assumed it had been long lost. And we asked my grandfather while he was still alive in the early 70s if he knew where it was, and he had no idea. So the assumption was that this film was long lost, but we had known it existed. And then after he died in the late 70s, my mom was the executor of his estate, and we were cleaning out his house and getting things in order. And I remember looking in his bedroom closet, and on the floor was this box at the back in the far corner, and I pulled it out, and inside it was 3 film reels. And I remember opening up one of the containers, one of the canisters, and being hit with this smell of, sort of reminded me of mothballs, a very pungent, very unpleasant odor. And later on, I was only 14 at the time, but later on when I got into the field of archives, I knew that smell is reminiscent of cellulose nitrate film, which when it produces that off gas is actually the film's in a state of deterioration. So at any rate, we didn't really know that at the time. So what we did was rent a reel-to-reel projector from our local library. And I remember one evening in our living room, we played the films, and it was fascinating to watch my mom dancing around on her front lawn in 1929 as a child, and seeing all these people, in some cases people I had never met, alive and well. And it was quite interesting to see. But we looked at the film once or twice and thought, that's it, we have to put this away, because it was starting to look like it wasn't going to survive too many more playings. So we packed it up. And then later on, I found out, of course, as I started becoming trained in the field, that one of the ways to protect film like this is to put it in cold storage, and that delays the deterioration. It's not perfect, of course, because all I have is a freezer at home to do this sort of thing. If you were doing this in a museum setting, you would have special freezers where the humidity is carefully controlled. Obviously, I don't have access to that. So what I did was triple bag in Ziploc bags, which is what is sometimes recommended for this sort of thing. And they've been stored in the freezer ever since. Even to this day, they're still in my freezer. Meanwhile, we made a VHS copy once that technology became available, where you could copy original reels. And then more recently, I had it digitized directly to a computer format, which is far better, and it protects the original this way, and the content is still there. Now I want to talk a little bit about touch-ups. This is something where software can come in and can be quite helpful. In this first example, I'm a huge Beatles fan. And some years ago, we went to England, and as a Beatle fan, as any Beatle fan might, I wanted to go see Abbey Road, where the Beatles' famous album cover was produced, and this is the exact spot. And my daughter and I are walking across Abbey Road. We didn't quite get the position right, because my wife didn't want to stand obviously in the middle of the road in a busy street in London, but we did want to at least get some capture of it. And I thought, I know software can do a lot of things to alter photos. In some cases, it could be for nefarious reasons, but in this case, I just wanted to clean it up. And I thought, well, let's try it out. Let's see what we can do. So I was but the erase feature in Photoshop, I was able to remove all the people around us. So it was just appeared to be just Laura and I crossing the road by ourselves. And you can see this, I did it basically as an experiment to see if I could do this sort of thing or not. And as it turns out, I think it turned out reasonably well. And I produced a shot that appears to be just us crossing the road, and all the other individuals were gone. And then you can replace where they would have been with the scenery behind them, and you can create the effect as if they were never there and you were all alone. I don't recommend doing this very often because I don't particularly like to alter, especially with a historical photo, alter the actual presentation of history or what's actually in the shot. So you always protect the original unaltered image as your master. And you can do this kind of thing just for display purposes. But what's more typically done is just sort of cleaning up a photograph. And this is where you're just doing minor touch-ups to take away scuffs and scratches and tears and stains and things of that nature. So I use the same Photoshop erase techniques and content replacement tools to take out scratches. That's a picture of my family. I'm the little guy sitting in my mom's lap, and my brothers and my sisters are there with my mom and dad. And I thought the photo needed a bit of cleanup because it was a print in this case, and obviously it's seen better days. So some minor touch-ups were done. And again, this is where once it's digitized, you can do this kind of thing yourself. It's worth trying and it's worth practicing. And if you've never done it before, it is kind of fun to give it a shot. And if it doesn't work out, there's no real harm, there's no loss. I also want to talk a bit about what you can do with odd shaped items or extremely fragile materials like glass plate negatives and what something in a case, for example, like a daguerreotype, ambrotypes, another format. This is something where if you have a camera on a tripod, you might be able to capture the images, but usually you'll run into problems with shadowing and reflections, and there's difficulties with also too. If you don't have a camera on a tripod and you just have a phone, you might see some shakiness, which means some blurriness. You won't get as crisp an image. But at the same time, you want to protect contents of large items that don't otherwise fit on a flatbed scanner. So there's different ways you can do that. One, you can hire professionals, as I said, for capturing moving images like home movies. You will have to use a professional company. There are companies that we have worked with that do quite a good job. The one that I usually use is a company called Digital Treasures. I'm not recommending them specifically, but I'm just stating a fact. That's the company that we have worked with, but there are others. And you would do your own due diligence and pick who you think is best. And other ways of setting this up, you can get lighting systems and put them on a platform. And then if you can have your camera on a tripod above an oversized item, depending on the size of it, you can also capture the contents that way. But it's a little more elaborate, a little more complicated. Now, there's a company that we've also worked with called Trent Photographics. We've had large items and unusual things that are very fragile, perhaps as well. It's a company that I've used in the past for taking large items, and the fellow that does this work uses a very sophisticated digital camera using the same kind of lenses and technology as the United States State Department or Defense Department would use on their satellite systems. So it's extremely sophisticated, but surprisingly affordable. And again, there's other companies that do this work too. I'm not recommending Trent Photographics, but basically I am stating that we have used them. So you do your own due diligence, as I said. And I also want to talk a little bit about documents. Photographs lend themselves naturally to digitization, but so certainly do documents. And the documents can be beautiful things in their own right, and certainly very interesting. So I recommend documenting or digitizing them as well if you have them. And this is examples of some of the ones that I've done and how they're in the end result. I talked last time about how when you scan a document and then put this print copy of the original in a frame, you can't tell, generally speaking, if it was the original in there or not. Because I never recommend anyone framing original documents when this option is now available for this sort of thing. So you take a color scan of the item, which I always recommend scanning in color, not black and white, because if you do that, it creates this generic, uniform, silvery tone and grayness to a photo, and all the texture and the nuances of the image are lost. But if you scan in color, you capture the true nature of whatever it is you're scanning, and that certainly applies to documents. And these couple of examples. And then in the end result, as I said, I did all of this for two reasons: preservation, getting an order of my vast amount of materials that had come my way, but also to find a way to display some of this. So as my daughter was growing up, she would see who her relatives were in the past, and we had space to do it. So we thought, why not? So if you're doing this, you want to get a variety of subject matter. I would recommend, if you've got the range of materials to work with, you might as well take advantage of that. And in my case, I went for individual portraits, group shots, shots of buildings, houses, and documents, as I just mentioned, and do things in different sizes, different types of frames, different shapes. And then you decide, and then themes too, because the shot on the right, for example, is wedding photos. And the way I arranged all of these was mostly by branch of family. So one side to the next, try to make sense around the hallway space that we used in our house. But with the case of the weddings, they were all different members together, but it was just a special thematic group, in this case, based on wedding portraits. And then you go from there. It takes time. It took us a few years to do it. Oh, I should also mention there's more than one stylistic way of laying them out. This is, I think, typically called the salon style. You'd see this in Victorian houses a lot, where it just feels like a mishmash. There is actually an order to it, but it's a more complicated display. It's sort of can be useful if you've got a lot to work with. This is on the right. This is a uniform linear format of for displaying images that my sister did in her house. And if you have certain three-dimensional objects that can withstand being displayed, such as these medals that my wife's grandfather's my wife's grandfather collected when he was a marathon runner. They can be displayed too in these things called shadow boxes. They give you a bit of depth and you can display materials. And then if you're doing this sort of thing, there is a tool, and I recommend everyone who's ever trying to frame anything, just create complex arrangements of things on the wall, to use this kind of tool. It's a hanging tool. You can get them at Home Depot and Best, or any kind of place that sells framing supplies, and I do recommend them because they make the job of marking where you want to nail a picture up and hang it very easy. And I would not have been able to do any of that hanging and framing work without that tool. So everyone should take a look at those. I just want to wrap it up briefly by talking about objects. And if you collect family materials, you'll have photos, you may have photo albums, you may have documents, and you might even have three-dimensional objects, mementos, sentimental things that mean something to you. And this is an example of some that I have that otherwise would be sitting in a box somewhere. And I decided, well, I think I could display some of these. So I got an idea of doing this sort of thing for my sister, because she had a curio cabinet and she was putting some of her family treasures and little sentimental items in a case at her house. And I thought I'd like to do that because I know I have similar things here at my own house. So you can get these kinds of cases, because what it allows you to do, first of all, is display things that you might think are of interest to yourself and maybe to others. It contains them, it keeps dust off of them, and it keeps them all together and relatively safe. But you always want to segregate and isolate materials that don't do well in direct sunlight or long exposures on display. So anything that's made of paper, typically you wouldn't do, but certain things you can. I mean, I'm probably taking a little bit of a risk of these things in some cases, because some of them are made of fabric, and that can be a little bit iffy. So I keep that to a minimum and rotate things out too from time to time, just to protect them. But it's a way of protecting material, mostly of sentimental value. It's something that you could consider doing yourself if you have things. And then I want to talk a little bit about this nondescript, although it's kind of a neat retro coffee can. At face value, it's just a coffee can, and it doesn't mean a lot, but I thought it was of interest. And the story behind this, I found this when I was dealing with the estate of my dad's house after he had passed away a few years ago. And I went up in the attic, which is an empty space. It's not finished. It was just an empty building space. And in there, I found this can sitting just on the ground. Presumably, it was probably catching drips from a leaky roof, I'm going to guess. But I thought it was kind of neat because it just was a cool looking coffee can. And my wife and I like this kind of retro stuff. So I decided to bring it home and put it on display above our cupboards. And fine, it's a nice coffee can, maybe for some interest, some visual interest. But I thought, why not I just write a note explaining where I found this, because it might be of interest to my daughter and people later on, if they decide they want to keep it, that is. That just explains what it was, and that I found it in my dad's house, and a bit more detail like that. So it takes what's just at face value a coffee can, and that's just a little bit more information that might lend a bit of value or has a bit of a story or anecdote associated with. And I would recommend, if you've got certain objects in your house, that you can do this kind of thing yourself. A little short, took all of a minute to write the note, and you stick it in there and basically forget about it. But someday someone will look at that and say, oh, that's why that was here. So it's just important. And that's capturing a little bit of what's called provenance, which is the history of past ownerships. And that term is used a lot with artworks, where you're tracking the chain of title of something, and it helps preserve its authenticity and its integrity. But it's also can be used to just keep information, and information lends value to something as opposed to just the face value of the object. Another thing I would recommend And I learned this more as I went through my life, talking to my family members, especially my elderly relatives. They often have stories to tell, and they're often very interested in sharing those stories. And if you have this opportunity, try to jot down what they tell you, because once they're gone, many of these little anecdotes and stories that they might want to share will be lost forever. And they may or may not be of great interest, but you can decide that later. But at least get the information recorded, either by talking to them and recording as you speak, using a mobile phone, because all mobile phones have this utility in them, or write notes down based on what they said to you. And I started doing that after many years of not doing it, because when I was a child, my mom and dad would tell me things, and I presumably basically just have to listen and go, yeah, whatever. But later on, I thought, no, I just got to stop doing that. I'm going to maybe record some of this information, because I knew these people aren't going to be around forever, and they may have some interesting things that are worth preserving, and those stories and anecdotes can sometimes be of great value as well. It doesn't relate to scanning and digitizing, but it does relate to what I'm saying here, to capturing information that you may someday be thankful that you did. So I guess that's pretty much it. That's the end of the presentation. I can be certainly happy to answer any questions, and if we run out of time, I'd be quite happy offline to answer any questions if people have anything they want to explore further with me. But that's it, folks. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Jim. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. If you don't mind, I know we are close to time, but hopefully that's
Sure.
okay. So one of the questions we had earlier on is, do you have any programs that you can recommend for creating a family tree?
Well, it depends on the software that you work with. There are some, but I can't remember off the top of my head what they are. There are several websites that review them. So I would recommend family tree software, and when I search for the sort of anything I'm looking for, I usually say family tree software, in this case as the example, and reviews. And then you'll see various websites and individual commentary about various software. But there are several for PC, and there's several and fewer for the Macintosh platform. I have a Macintosh at home, so we use the Macintosh program. Off the top of my head, unfortunately, I can't recall Family Tree Reunion. It's called Reunion on the Macintosh, but I don't recall any of the names on the PC, but there are several. And there are many apps too. So if you look in the App Store and Google Play App Store, or the Apple Store, you'll find various software, and they're all reviewed. So I would start looking there. There's lots of choices. That's one good thing.
Awesome. And then the next question is from Farah. She's asking, do you have any advice about how to archive digitized children's artwork? I find the originals, the colors, paper, dried glue fade over time.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, and then follow up, is there a way to display them so they don't fade?
Yep. I'd use the same technique as with photographs. So they would be, you could scan them if they're not too large. If they can be laid flat on a flatbed scanner, if you happen to have one, they can be scanned just as effectively as any document, and scan in color, obviously, because you want to capture the vibrancy of the work. And then the originals simply put in a file folder, ideally acid-free. And that's where there are companies that sell these kinds of supplies. The one that is closest to us where we live here in the GTA is called Car McLean. They're on Queen Street in downtown Toronto, and they have a mail order service. That's one. There's another company called Gaylord. And some of these are in the United States, so it's a little bit trickier, but Car McLean is the place to check out. They have a website with catalogs, and you can certainly get some material from them. Uline is another company that's based in Milton, and they have a mail order service and an online website, and you can buy acid-free file folders from them. Their range of supplies are more limited to what Car McLean can give you. But if it's an artwork, it probably should be in an enclosure of some kind, and then in a box, protected from sunlight. But you definitely would want to preserve it. And you want to make sure that there's nothing pushing on it or bending it or causing it to curve, or you want to keep it stable. So if you have a mostly empty box, you want to fill the box with other things to kind of shore it up, so that whatever's in a file folder are upright, not tilted over or leaning, or laid flat, ideally too.
Awesome. So I think those were all the questions that had come in. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today, and thank you, Jim, for an amazing talk. Just a reminder, PAMA is currently closed to the public, but we are looking forward to welcoming our visitors back very soon, so please continue to check our website for updates. We also have 2 talks that are coming up this February that are both virtual as well, and next week we have an artist panel talk for our new exhibition Power Play on February 3rd, so you can find all those listings on our PAMA homepage, so we do hope to see you again soon. So thank you so much for joining us today.